It was a bustling morning at the airport, the kind of day where everything seemed to be in a rush. Travelers hurried from one gate to the next, families chatted loudly as they gathered their belongings, and workers shuffled past in their uniforms, either preparing for or finishing their shifts. Among this chaotic scene, a figure stood apart, blending seamlessly with the crowd despite his unmistakable presence. Elon Musk shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a habit he'd adopted over the years whenever he found himself waiting in places like this. The airport, much like any other, was a place where people hurried, caught up in their own thoughts and concerns. But for Elon, the constant exposure to the public eye was something that could grow tiresome. His eyes scanned the digital display board above the gate, flicking over the flight information. Flight 827 to Austin was on schedule. It was a rare blessing for someone who often found himself dealing with unexpected delays and setbacks. He took a brief moment of relief, adjusting the strap of his backpack. The weight dug into his shoulder, a small discomfort that added to the fatigue of the morning. It wasn't just the physical load he was carrying, but the mental one as well. Today was one of those days where Elon longed for anonymity. He wasn't in the mood for selfies, nor did he feel like engaging in the endless conversations that people often tried to strike up with him. His choice of attire, a hoodie, an old pair of jeans, and scuffed sneakers, was deliberate. It was a way of blending in, of being just another traveler in the sea of faces that passed through the airport. Even billionaires, he reasoned, got tired of the attention, the constant stares, and the ever-present curiosity of the public. The line for first-class boarding was shorter than expected, a small blessing that gave him hope for a smooth experience. Elon had work to do, emails to review, notes to jot down for a presentation later that day. His team at SpaceX was counting on him to deliver. He thrived under pressure, finding that his mind worked best when focused on the task at hand. But as he stood there, waiting for his turn to board, his thoughts began to wander. He thought of the charity event he was scheduled to attend after the meeting in Austin. It was for a cause that was near to his heart, providing STEM education resources to underserved communities. Elon knew how important it was to encourage the next generation of innovators, and he could already picture the excited faces of the children who would benefit from the resources his event would help provide. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, hidden beneath the hood he wore, as he imagined the joy those kids would feel. But just as quickly as the smile appeared, it faded. A voice, sharp and demanding, cut through his thoughts. "Excuse me." Elon glanced up, still partially concealed by the hood, and saw a woman approaching him. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor, the sound echoing through the terminal. She walked with purpose, her expression one that could stop traffic, not because of admiration, but because it demanded attention. Elon's gut instinct told him that this would be one of those moments. He could feel it, the sort of interaction that was bound to be uncomfortable, unnecessary, and potentially conflict-ridden. The woman came to a stop in front of him, glaring as if he had somehow done something to offend her. "Are you lost or something?" she asked, her tone sharp, almost accusatory. Elon didn't respond immediately. Over the years, he had learned that patience was often the best way to handle these situations. A younger version of himself might have snapped back with a witty retort, but now he knew that engaging with such behavior only fueled the fire. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. She appeared to be in her late 40s or early 50s, her face exuding an air of self-importance. Her hair was styled with precision, and her makeup flawless. The designer outfit she wore screamed wealth and sophistication. Everything about her suggested that she was someone who expected respect simply because of her appearance. She carried herself like she owned the room, or in this case, the airport. "I'm sorry," Elon said, his voice calm and neutral, giving little away about his thoughts. The woman let out a huff, as if the very act of explaining herself was beneath her. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes as she took in his appearance. "This is the first-class line," she said, her gaze assessing him like a judge about to pass sentence. "You don't look like you belong here." Elon blinked, unsure whether he had heard her correctly. He had come to the airport this morning not for a confrontation, but for a simple flight. He hadn't expected to be judged over something as trivial as his appearance. "I have a first-class ticket," he said, keeping his tone measured, trying to defuse the situation with as little energy as possible. He pulled back the hood slightly, hoping that making his voice clearer would help to resolve the misunderstanding. Her response came quickly, a sharp, almost mocking laugh. "Sure you do," she said, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Look, I don't have time for games. The economy line is over there." She gestured dismissively toward the far side of the boarding area, as if he were some sort of nuisance who didn't belong in the same space as her. For a moment, Elon debated whether it was worth responding. A younger version of himself might have fired back with a sarcastic comment, but he had learned over the years that not every battle needed to be fought. "Ma'am," he began again, his voice calm but firm, "I promise you, I'm in the right line." She didn't listen. "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice rising loud enough to draw the attention of people nearby. "People like you always try to sneak into places you don't belong. It's not fair to the rest of us who actually paid for our tickets." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Elon could feel the stares of the people around them, the weight of dozens of eyes watching as this unnecessary spectacle unfolded. He could hear the murmurs from the crowd as some whispered to each other, while others simply stared, unsure of what was happening. Elon remained composed. He took a deep breath, pushing down the frustration that began to bubble up within him. "I assure you," he said, his tone still measured, "I paid for my ticket just like everyone else here." But the woman, Karen, as it would turn out, wasn't finished. "If you don't move," she threatened, her voice now shrill, "I'll call security." Elon glanced around, noticing the growing crowd. This was the last thing he wanted, attention. And yet, there he was, at the center of an unwanted drama. Before he could respond, Karen had already flagged down a nearby security officer, her arms cutting through the air like a flare signaling for help. "Officer," she called out, her voice commanding attention. "This man is trying to cut into the first-class line without a proper ticket." The officer, a stocky man with a neat uniform, approached cautiously, scanning the situation. He quickly assessed the scene, his eyes darting between the irate woman and the calm figure of Elon. "Ma'am, what seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his tone professional but cautious. Elon sighed inwardly, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack a little tighter as he prepared for the conversation that was about to unfold. The officer's presence did little to quell the tension in the air. "This man is trying to sneak into the first-class line," Karen repeated, her voice laced with indignation. "I've watched him from the moment he walked up here. He's not supposed to be here." The officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving from Karen to Elon, who stood with an unbothered expression. "Sir," he addressed Elon, "do you have a first-class ticket?" Elon nodded, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his boarding pass. "Here," he said, handing the officer the paper. The officer scanned it briefly, then glanced up at Elon before passing the boarding pass back to him. "Everything seems to be in order," the officer said after a brief pause. "You're allowed to board from this line." Karen's face flushed a deep shade of red, the kind of red that only comes from embarrassment mixed with frustration. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but the officer cut her off before she could speak. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "there's no issue here. This gentleman has every right to be in this line. I suggest you return to your seat and allow him to board in peace." The words were sharp, but his tone was professional. Karen stood there, seething with fury, her arms still crossed in defiance. For a long moment, it seemed as though she might continue to argue, but then she huffed loudly, turned on her heel, and stormed away without another word. Elon watched her retreating figure, feeling a slight sense of relief wash over him. He didn't enjoy confrontations, particularly ones that were built on assumptions and a lack of understanding. Yet, in this moment, it felt like the right thing to do had been done. As the officer turned back to Elon, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Apologies for the inconvenience, sir," he said. "I'll let you get back to your boarding process." "No problem," Elon replied. His tone was polite, but there was a certain weariness in his voice that betrayed the annoyance he had felt. He hadn't wanted to make a scene, but it seemed that sometimes these things couldn't be avoided. With a nod from the officer, Elon continued forward, his steps quickening as he neared the jet bridge. He was finally free of the unwanted drama, or so he thought. As he walked down the corridor toward the plane, his mind began to wander once again. He thought about the brief interaction with Karen. People like her, he mused, were often quick to judge and slow to listen. Her assumptions about him, based solely on his appearance and the fact that he hadn't fit her narrow expectations, had almost cost him a smooth boarding experience. It wasn't just the confrontation that bothered him, it was the fact that people could so easily be quick to make judgments about others without knowing the full story. Elon had grown accustomed to this. People judged him based on the media they consumed, the narrative that was spun around him. He wasn't surprised by Karen's behavior, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of sadness. Why was it so easy for people to assume the worst in others? Why did they focus so much on differences rather than what they had in common? As he entered the aircraft, Elon glanced around, noting the familiar first-class seats and the comfort that awaited him. It was a brief moment of peace, a respite from the chaos of the outside world. But it also gave him a chance to reflect. He had worked tirelessly for years to build the companies that had made him successful, SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, and others. Yet, even with all his achievements, he was still subject to the whims of those who didn't know him. To some, he was the eccentric billionaire who was always pushing the limits of technology. To others, he was just another man with a title. He found his seat and settled in, adjusting the leather armrests before buckling in for takeoff. The flight attendants moved quickly around him, offering snacks and drinks to the other passengers, but Elon barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of the future. It wasn't long before the plane began its ascent, and the familiar hum of the engines filled the cabin. Elon's eyes closed, the weight of the day slowly dissipating as the airplane climbed higher into the sky. The world outside the window was becoming a blur, a swirl of clouds and distant lights. Inside, the cabin was calm, quiet, and peaceful. The hum of the engines in the background and the gentle rocking of the plane offered Elon a brief moment of respite, but it wasn't long before the world around him started to intrude once again. As much as he craved solitude, his mind was perpetually in motion. Ideas flowed endlessly, and as he glanced at his laptop screen, he couldn't help but think about the future of humanity, his life's work, his purpose. His thoughts turned toward Mars. Elon had spoken countless times about the need for humanity to become a multiplanetary species, and the idea had always consumed him. SpaceX's Mars colonization project was his vision, and it was an audacious one. There were skeptics, of course. Many thought the dream of reaching Mars was too far-fetched, too costly, and ultimately too dangerous. But Elon wasn't one to shy away from danger or the improbable. He had proven time and again that what seemed impossible was simply a challenge to be met. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that humanity's future depended on space exploration. Earth, with all its beauty and resources, was a fragile and finite place. Climate change, pandemics, political instability, all these threats were looming. But if humanity could establish a foothold on another planet, the risks would be mitigated. It wasn't about escaping Earth's problems, it was about ensuring survival. Mars, with its harsh environment and unyielding landscape, was not a sanctuary, it was a challenge. But it was a challenge worth taking, worth overcoming. He imagined a colony of people living on Mars. They would have to adapt, learn, and innovate in ways that humanity had never done before. It wouldn't be easy, and the road to Mars was fraught with obstacles, but the rewards would be immense. A new chapter in human history would begin there, and Elon wanted to be at the forefront of it. He was already envisioning the infrastructure, self-sustaining habitats, advanced technologies, new methods of agriculture that would work in Martian soil. The possibilities seemed endless. But Elon knew that before any of that could happen, the most critical task would be ensuring a safe, reliable means of transport. The development of the Starship rocket was central to this vision. Starship was not just another spacecraft, it was the key to interplanetary travel. It needed to be capable of carrying hundreds of people, tons of cargo, and all the necessary supplies for a long journey. Elon had always believed that technology could solve almost any problem, but the scale of this challenge was enormous. It was about creating a vessel that could withstand the vast distances of space, the immense temperatures, the deep vacuum of space, and most importantly, the dangers of re-entry. But the promise of Starship was greater than just Mars. It was about unlocking the potential for space tourism, for more frequent and more accessible space travel. It was about making the dream of exploring space a reality for anyone, not just astronauts. But as with all his ventures, SpaceX was facing hurdles. The development of Starship had been slow, complicated, and expensive. The first few prototypes had failed spectacularly, with massive explosions that became viral spectacles. But Elon had seen failure differently. He didn't view it as a setback, he saw it as a lesson. Each failure brought them closer to success. The constant push to improve, to innovate, was what kept him going. He didn't mind criticism or setbacks because he understood that true progress was never linear. As the plane continued its journey, Elon found himself thinking back on his earlier years. He had come from humble beginnings, from a childhood in South Africa, where his family struggled financially. But it was there, in that environment, that Elon had developed his deep interest in technology and science. His father had been a tough, often distant figure, but it was through his influence that Elon had learned the value of hard work and perseverance. His mother, on the other hand, had always been supportive, encouraging him to follow his passions. It wasn't an easy path to get to where he was today. Elon had faced rejection, ridicule, and failure countless times. There were those who doubted him, who thought his ideas were too ambitious or unrealistic. But his passion and determination had always kept him going. He had founded Zip2, his first company, at a time when the internet was still in its infancy. After selling it for a significant amount, he moved on to create X.com, which eventually became PayPal. But it was SpaceX and Tesla that truly defined his legacy. He had always believed in the power of technology to change the world, but he had also come to understand the importance of people in that equation. Without the right team, without the right partners, even the most brilliant ideas would falter. The people who worked for him at Tesla and SpaceX were just as important as the technology itself. He had surrounded himself with brilliant minds, engineers, designers, dreamers, all of whom shared his vision. They were the ones who brought his ideas to life, who made the impossible possible. Elon's phone buzzed again, pulling him back to the present moment. He glanced at T. His attention shifted back to his work, and he quickly typed a response, offering some feedback on the test. But as he did, his thoughts returned to Karen, the woman from earlier. The brief confrontation had stayed with him. He was used to people misunderstanding him, judging him based on his wealth, his success, or even his eccentricities. But it wasn't just about him. It was a reflection of a larger societal issue, the tendency to judge people based on appearances, to label them without truly understanding who they were. As a public figure, Elon had experienced his fair share of criticism and judgment. Some people admired him for his vision, his boldness, and his willingness to take risks. Others criticized him for being too aggressive, too ambitious, or too reckless. He had been called everything from a genius to a madman. But he didn't let it bother him. He had learned early on that people would always talk, and that the opinions of others were often shaped by their own insecurities, fears, and biases. He knew that true innovation required a certain level of discomfort. It required challenging the norms, pushing past limitations, and going beyond what was expected. And that was exactly what he intended to do. As the flight continued, the sun began to set on the horizon. The colors outside the window shifted from soft blue to rich oranges and reds, casting a warm glow across the cabin. Elon leaned back in his seat, staring out at the endless sky. The world, he thought, was full of possibilities. It was up to him, and those who shared his vision, to unlock them. There was still so much to be done. The road ahead was long and filled with challenges, but Elon was ready. He was always ready for what came next.